The German machine gun nests spat death across the cratered landscape as Lieutenant Colonel George Marshall pressed his field glasses against his eyes. Watching the morning mist rise from the shell-torn village of Cantigny, it was May 27, 1918, and the fate of American military prestige in the Great War hung in the balance like morning fog over no man's land. Marshall lowered his glasses and turned to the young captain beside him. "In 3 hours, Captain, the 28th Infantry Regiment will either prove that American soldiers can fight as well as any European army, or will be remembered as the division that failed in its first real test." The weight of expectation pressed down on them like the humid French air that clung to their wool uniforms. The village of Cantigny had become more than just another dot on the Western Front maps. For months, German forces had used this strategic position to launch devastating attacks against French positions. And now it fell to the 1st Division of the American Expeditionary Forces to prove that the doughboys could do more than just fill trenches. General John Pershing himself had insisted that American forces would fight as independent units rather than being absorbed into British or French commands. Cantigny would be their proving ground. As reported by the New York Times in their comprehensive coverage of the American involvement in World War I, the pressure on American forces was immense, with both Allied commanders and the American public watching closely for signs that the United States could contribute meaningfully to the war effort. Major Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president, checked his wristwatch for the 100th time that morning. Around him, soldiers of the 26th and 28th Infantry Regiments crouched in their jumping-off trenches, their faces painted with mud and determination. Many of these men had never seen combat before arriving in France, but months of brutal training under French and British instructors had transformed farmers, factory workers, and shop clerks into a fighting force that looked remarkably professional in the pre-dawn darkness. The artillery preparation had been going on for over an hour now, with French 75s and American howitzers pounding German positions in and around Cantigny. The constant thunder of the guns made conversation impossible, so orders were passed by hand signals and written notes. Roosevelt felt the familiar mixture of fear and anticipation that he remembered from his father's stories of San Juan Hill, though this battlefield bore no resemblance to the Cuban hills of the Spanish-American War. Sergeant Michael O'Brien from Boston crawled along the trench line, checking equipment and offering quiet words of encouragement to his men. He had volunteered for service the day after President Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany, leaving behind a wife and 2 young children to serve his country. Now, as he looked at the scared but determined faces around him, he wondered if his decision had been the right one. The German response to the American artillery barrage was swift and brutal. Counter-battery fire began falling among the American positions, sending geysers of mud and shrapnel through the air. A direct hit on a supply trench killed 3 men instantly and wounded half a dozen others, but the attack preparations continued without pause. There could be no turning back now. As 0 hour approached, the sounds of battle seemed to intensify rather than diminish, as if the very earth itself was awakening to the violence about to unfold across its scarred surface. At exactly 6:45 on the morning of May 28, 1918, the American artillery barrage lifted from the German front lines and began walking deeper into enemy territory. This was the signal that every soldier in the attacking force had been waiting for, and Lieutenant Colonel Marshall's whistle blast sent nearly 3,000 American soldiers surging forward into the smoky hell of no man's land. Private James Anderson from Nebraska had never imagined that war could be so loud. A combination of exploding shells, chattering machine guns, and shouting men created a symphony of violence that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. He stumbled forward through the maze of shell craters and barbed wire, his rifle clutched tightly in hands that trembled from more than just the cold morning air. The German defenders of Cantigny were not caught completely by surprise. They had weathered the American artillery barrage in their deep bunkers and emerged to meet the attacking infantry, with a devastating crossfire of machine gun and rifle fire. The MG-08 machine guns that had dominated European battlefields for nearly 4 years now turned their attention to these new enemies from across the Atlantic. Major Roosevelt found himself leading a group of soldiers around the remains of what had once been a church on the outskirts of Cantigny. German snipers had taken positions in the rubble, and their accurate fire was taking a steady toll on the advancing Americans. Roosevelt grabbed a rifle from a wounded soldier and began returning fire, his political connections forgotten in the heat of combat. The fighting for Cantigny village itself was house-to-house, room-by-room combat of the most brutal kind. German defenders had turned every cellar into a fortress and every window into a firing position. American soldiers learned quickly that taking a building meant clearing it completely, as German soldiers often emerged from hiding places to attack from behind. Sergeant O'Brien led his squad through what had once been the main street of Cantigny, now little more than a path between piles of rubble. A German grenade exploded nearby, wounding 2 of his men and leaving his ears ringing. He could see other American units advancing on both flanks, their progress marked by the steady crack of rifle fire and the occasional explosion of a hand grenade. The most difficult fighting occurred around the German command post, which had been established in the basement of the village school. Here, a determined group of German officers and non-commissioned officers put up fierce resistance. Using the building's thick walls and narrow corridors to their advantage, it took nearly 2 hours of close-quarters fighting before American soldiers finally cleared the position. By noon, the American flag was flying over what remained of Cantigny's town hall, but the battle was far from over. German artillery observers had been watching the attack from hidden positions, and now a devastating counterbarrage began falling on the newly captured village. The Americans found themselves in the same positions that the Germans had occupied that morning, trying to hold ground while enemy shells rained down around them. Private Anderson huddled in a shell crater with 3 other soldiers, wondering if they would survive long enough to see another sunset. The German artillery seemed to know exactly where every American position was located, and the shells were falling with terrifying accuracy. Several direct hits on American positions had already caused heavy casualties among the attacking force. The real test of American resolve was about to begin, as German commanders prepared their counterattack to retake Cantigny. The village had changed hands twice already during the war, and both sides understood its strategic importance. For the Americans, holding Cantigny would prove that they belonged on European battlefields. For the Germans, retaking it would demonstrate that these newcomers were no match for experienced European soldiers who had been fighting this war for nearly 4 years. The German counterattack came at 3 o'clock that afternoon with the precision and fury that had made the Kaiser's army feared across Europe. 2 companies of veteran infantry, supported by artillery fire that seemed to know exactly where every American position lay hidden, advanced toward Cantigny with the confidence of soldiers who had driven back attacks by British, French, and Russian forces. Lieutenant Colonel Marshall watched the approaching enemy through his field glasses from a position in what had once been Cantigny's bakery. The building's thick stone walls provided some protection from shell fragments, but he knew that if the German attack succeeded, these same walls would become his tomb. Around him, American soldiers prepared their weapons and checked their ammunition supplies, their faces grim with the knowledge that the next few hours would determine their fate. Major Roosevelt had established his command post in the basement of a partially destroyed house near the center of the village. From here, he could coordinate the defense of the American positions, while remaining relatively safe from German artillery fire. His radio man was trying desperately to maintain contact with divisional headquarters, but German jamming efforts were making communication increasingly difficult. The German advance was methodical and professional, with each squad providing covering fire while others moved forward. These were not the enthusiastic volunteers who had marched toward Paris in 1914, but hardened veterans who had survived nearly 4 years of brutal warfare. They moved with the economy of motion that comes only from extensive combat experience, using every piece of cover and concealment that the battlefield provided. Sergeant O'Brien's position came under attack first, as German infantry attempted to flank the American line by moving through the ruins of several houses on the village's eastern edge. The fighting was intense and personal, with grenades being thrown through windows and rifle fire echoing from room to room. O'Brien found himself engaged in hand-to-hand combat with a German sergeant, both men grappling for control of a rifle while shells exploded around them. According to detailed military records maintained by the War Department and later published in official histories of American involvement in World War I, the fighting at Cantigny represented a crucial test of American military capabilities under extreme combat conditions. Private Anderson discovered that real combat bore little resemblance to the training exercises he had participated in back in the United States. The noise was overwhelming, making it difficult to hear orders or coordinate with other soldiers. The smell of cordite and death hung heavy in the air. The sight of wounded and dead comrades tested his resolve in ways that no amount of training could have prepared him for. The German artillery support for their counterattack was particularly devastating, with shells falling among American positions with deadly accuracy. Several direct hits on American strongpoints caused heavy casualties and forced survivors to retreat to secondary positions. The carefully planned defensive layout that had been established after the morning's attack was beginning to crumble under the pressure of sustained German fire. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that the German counterattack was being pressed with unusual determination. Intelligence reports suggested that German commanders viewed the American success at Cantigny as a serious threat to their strategic position in this sector of the front. If American forces could successfully attack and hold German positions, it would prove that the United States was capable of making a significant military contribution to the Allied war effort. The fighting reached its climax as German soldiers penetrated into the heart of Cantigny village, threatening to split the American defensive line in two. Hand-to-hand combat raged through the ruins of houses and shops, with soldiers on both sides fighting with a desperation born of the knowledge that retreat meant death or capture. The outcome of America's first major offensive operation of World War I hung in the balance as the sun began to set over the blood-soaked battlefield. As darkness fell over Cantigny on May 28, 1918, the sound of battle gradually diminished to sporadic rifle fire and the occasional explosion of a German shell. Both sides had fought themselves to exhaustion. And now came the grim business of counting casualties and preparing for whatever tomorrow might bring. Lieutenant Colonel Marshall made his way through the American positions, checking on his men and assessing the situation. What he found both encouraged and dismayed him. The American soldiers had fought with remarkable courage and determination, proving that they could hold their own against experienced German forces. However, the cost had been severe, with nearly 200 casualties among the attacking force. In a shell crater near the village church, Private Anderson tended to a wounded comrade, whose leg had been shattered by shell fragments. The injured soldier, barely 18 years old, kept asking if his mother would be proud of him. When she received news of his sacrifice, Anderson had no answer except to assure him that help was coming, though he wasn't sure if that was true. The German withdrawal had not been a retreat in the traditional sense, but rather a tactical repositioning to more defensible positions on the high ground overlooking Cantigny. German artillery observers still maintained excellent visibility of American positions. Sporadic shelling continued throughout the night. Every movement in the village drew immediate fire, making it extremely difficult to evacuate wounded soldiers or bring forward supplies. Major Roosevelt established casualty collection points in the most protected buildings he could find, but even these locations were not safe from German artillery fire. Medical corpsmen worked by candlelight and flashlight, performing emergency surgery under conditions that would have been considered impossible in peacetime. The wounded bore their pain with remarkable stoicism, understanding that their suffering was part of something larger than themselves. Sergeant O'Brien discovered that leading men in combat was fundamentally different from the leadership challenges he had faced in civilian life. Here, soldiers followed orders not because they had to, but because they trusted their leaders to make decisions that would keep them alive and help them accomplish their mission. The bonds formed between soldiers under fire were unlike anything he had previously experienced. Supply became a critical problem as the night wore on. German artillery fire made it nearly impossible to bring forward ammunition, food, or medical supplies. Soldiers shared their remaining rations and ammunition, creating an improvised logistics system based on mutual support rather than formal military procedure. Water became particularly precious, as many of the village wells had been contaminated by decomposing bodies or chemical residues from exploded shells. The psychological impact of sustained combat began to show itself among some soldiers. Shell shock, as it was then called, affected men differently, but the symptoms were unmistakable: uncontrollable trembling, inability to speak coherently, and a 1,000-yard stare that seemed to look through rather than at the world around them. Officers tried to provide support for these men while maintaining the fighting effectiveness of their units. Communication with higher headquarters remained sporadic throughout the night. German jamming efforts and damaged telephone lines made it difficult for divisional commanders to understand the true situation in Cantigny. This isolation added to the psychological pressure on American forces, who were unsure whether reinforcements would arrive or whether they would be ordered to withdraw from their hard-won positions. As dawn approached on May 29th, it became clear that the German forces were preparing for another assault. Artillery fire increased in intensity, and patrols reported German infantry moving into attack positions. The Americans would have to prove once again that they could hold ground against determined enemy attacks. The question that haunted every soldier in Cantigny was whether they had the strength and ammunition to repel another German assault. Many were wounded, all were exhausted, and supplies were critically low. Yet there was no talk of surrender or retreat. These soldiers had come too far and sacrificed too much to give up now. Dawn on May 29, 1918, brought with it the realization that the Battle of Cantigny had become something more than just another engagement on the Western Front. Word was spreading through Allied headquarters that American forces had not only successfully attacked a German position, but had held it against determined counterattacks throughout the night. General John J. Pershing himself arrived at divisional headquarters that morning to assess the situation personally. The commander of the American Expeditionary Forces understood that Cantigny represented more than just a tactical victory. It was proof that American soldiers could fight effectively in European-style warfare. The political implications of this success would resonate far beyond the battlefield. Lieutenant Colonel Marshall met with his company commanders. As German artillery continued to fall sporadically on American positions, assessment was sobering. Ammunition was running low, medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and nearly a quarter of the attacking force had become casualties. Yet morale remained surprisingly high as soldiers understood that they had accomplished something significant. Private Anderson had been promoted to corporal during the night, replacing a non-commissioned officer who had been killed by shell fire. The promotion came not with ceremony or congratulation, but simply with increased responsibility for the men around him. He found himself making decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for soldiers who looked to him for leadership. The German response to their failure to retake Cantigny was swift and brutal. Artillery fire increased throughout the morning, with shells falling on American positions every few minutes. The accuracy of this fire suggested that German observers had maintained excellent visibility of American movements, despite the capture of the village. Several direct hits on American strongpoints caused additional casualties and forced tactical adjustments to defensive positions. Major Roosevelt coordinated the evacuation of wounded soldiers, a process made extraordinarily difficult by continuing German fire. Stretcher bearers worked in teams, moving wounded men from building to building during lulls in the shelling. The courage displayed by medical personnel during this operation was remarkable, as they repeatedly exposed themselves to enemy fire to save their comrades. The logistical challenge of sustaining American forces in Cantigny became increasingly severe as the day progressed. Supply convoys attempting to reach the village came under immediate artillery fire, forcing them to abandon their loads and seek cover. Soldiers began rationing their remaining ammunition and water, sharing resources in an informal system that reflected the brotherhood forged by shared combat experience. News of the American success at Cantigny began to spread through Allied lines and eventually reached newspapers in the United States. For the first time since American forces had begun arriving in France, there was concrete evidence that these soldiers could contribute meaningfully to the war effort. The psychological impact of this news was enormous, both for Allied morale and for German strategic planning. According to contemporary reports in major American newspapers, including detailed coverage by war correspondents embedded with American forces, the Battle of Cantigny represented a turning point in public perception of American military capabilities in World War I. Intelligence reports indicated that German commanders were planning a major counterattack to retake Cantigny, involving significantly more forces than the previous day's assault. This information created a difficult decision for American commanders. Should they attempt to hold the position with their depleted forces? Or should they withdraw to more defensible positions and claim victory based on their successful initial attack? The decision to hold Cantigny ultimately came from General Pershing himself, who understood that withdrawing after such a short time would undermine the political and psychological value of the American success. Orders came down through the chain of command. Cantigny would be held at all costs, regardless of German counterattacks or continuing casualties. As afternoon turned to evening, on May 29th, American soldiers in Cantigny prepared for what many believed would be their final battle. Ammunition was distributed carefully, with priority given to automatic weapons and positions that would bear the brunt of any German assault. Final letters were written, personal effects were sorted, and soldiers made peace with the possibility that they might not survive the coming night. By June 1, 1918, the situation at Cantigny had stabilized into something resembling a conventional trench warfare position. German forces had abandoned their attempts to retake the village after suffering heavy casualties in repeated assaults, and American forces had successfully consolidated their defensive positions. What had begun as a limited attack had evolved into a strategic victory, with implications far beyond the local battlefield. The casualty figures from the Battle of Cantigny told a sobering story of the price of victory in modern warfare. The 1st Division had suffered over 1,000 casualties, including nearly 200 killed in action. German casualties were estimated to be even higher, particularly during their failed counterattacks. These numbers represented more than just statistics. They represented the dreams and aspirations of young men from both sides of the Atlantic who would never return home. Lieutenant Colonel Marshall found himself promoted to full colonel in recognition of his leadership during the battle. The promotion came with increased responsibilities and the knowledge that his decisions at Cantigny would influence American tactical doctrine for the remainder of the war. His after-action reports emphasized the importance of artillery support, effective communication, and the remarkable courage displayed by American soldiers under extreme combat conditions. Private Anderson, now Corporal Anderson, discovered that surviving combat had changed him in ways that he was only beginning to understand. The young farmer from Nebraska who had volunteered for military service barely resembled the battle-hardened veteran who now led a squad of soldiers with quiet confidence. The bonds formed with his fellow soldiers during the fighting at Cantigny would last for the rest of his life. Major Theodore Roosevelt Jr. emerged from Cantigny with enhanced respect among both his men and his superiors. His willingness to share the dangers faced by enlisted soldiers had earned him a level of credibility that his famous name alone could never have provided. He would go on to command larger units as the war progressed, always remembering the lessons learned during those desperate hours in a small French village. Sergeant O'Brien received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during the German counterattacks. The medal ceremony was brief and understated. Conducted in a field hospital where O'Brien was recovering from wounds received during the final day of fighting, he accepted the decoration on behalf of all the soldiers who had served under his command, many of whom would never receive the recognition they deserved. The strategic impact of Cantigny extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. German commanders began to reassess their assumptions about American military capabilities. While Allied leaders gained confidence in the fighting ability of American forces, the success at Cantigny paved the way for larger American operations later in 1918, including the battles of Château Thierry and Belleau Wood. News of the American victory at Cantigny reached the United States through newspaper reports and official military. For the first time since the declaration of war, American families could point to a concrete military success achieved by their sons and husbands. The psychological impact of this news was enormous, providing justification for the enormous sacrifices that American society was making to support the war effort. The tactical lessons learned at Cantigny influenced American military doctrine for years to come. The importance of combined arms coordination, effective communication systems, and thorough preparation became standard elements of American military planning. The courage and determination displayed by American soldiers under fire proved that they could match the fighting ability of any army in the world. General Pershing's decision to maintain American forces as independent units rather than integrating them into British or French commands was vindicated by the success at Cantigny. This victory provided the political and military justification for continued American independence on the battlefield, setting the stage for larger American operations as the war progressed toward its conclusion. 50 years after the Battle of Cantigny, veterans of the 1st Division gathered in a small ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery to remember their fallen comrades and reflect on the significance of their achievement. The elderly men who assembled that day bore little resemblance to the young soldiers who had charged across no man's land on May 28, 1918, but their memories of that battle remained vivid and profound. Colonel Marshall, now retired and serving as an elder statesman of the American military establishment, spoke about the transformation he had witnessed in American soldiers during their first major combat operation of World War I. He emphasized that Cantigny had proved not just that Americans could fight, that they could fight effectively alongside the best armies in the world. The lessons learned in that small French village had influenced American military thinking through World War II and beyond. Corporal Anderson, who had returned to his Nebraska farm after the war, brought with him a small collection of artifacts from Cantigny, a German helmet, a piece of shrapnel that had nearly killed him, and a photograph of his squad taken just before the battle. These items served as tangible connections to experiences that seemed almost impossible to communicate to people who had never faced combat. The quiet farmer rarely spoke of his war experiences, but his family understood that something profound had happened to him in France. The village of Cantigny itself had been rebuilt after the war, but careful observers could still see evidence of the battle that had made it famous. Unexploded shells occasionally surfaced in farmers' fields, and the local cemetery contained graves of both American and German soldiers who had died during the fighting. The French government erected a small monument commemorating the American victory, recognizing the significance of this battle in the broader context of the war. Major Roosevelt went on to serve with distinction in World War II, eventually rising to the rank of brigadier general and serving in the European theater of operations. His experiences at Cantigny had taught him valuable lessons about leadership under extreme pressure, lessons that served him well during the even larger conflicts that followed. He never forgot the soldiers who had served under his command during those desperate days in May 1918. The families of soldiers who had been killed at Cantigny faced the difficult task of finding meaning in their losses. Gold Star mothers traveled to France in the years after the war to visit the graves of their sons, trying to understand the cause for which their children had died. The American Battle Monuments Commission worked to ensure that these sacrifices would be remembered and honored by future generations. Military historians studying the Battle of Cantigny identified it as a crucial turning point in American military development. The tactical innovations developed during the fighting, leadership qualities displayed by American officers, the courage shown by enlisted soldiers, established patterns that would be repeated in subsequent American military operations. The battle proved that American forces could adapt quickly to European warfare conditions and fight effectively against experienced opponents. The psychological impact of Cantigny on American national consciousness cannot be overstated. For the first time in the nation's history, American soldiers had participated successfully in a major European conflict, proving that the United States could project military power across the Atlantic Ocean and make a meaningful contribution to global security. This achievement laid the groundwork for America's emergence as a world power in the 20th century. The bonds forged between soldiers during the Battle of Cantigny lasted throughout their lives and beyond. Veterans, organizations, informal gatherings, and correspondence networks maintained connections between men who had shared the ultimate test of human endurance. These relationships provided support and understanding that helped many veterans cope with the psychological challenges of returning to civilian life after experiencing the intensity of modern combat. As the last veterans of Cantigny passed away in the 1970s and 80s, their legacy lived on in the institutions and traditions they had helped to establish. The 1st Division continued to serve with distinction in subsequent conflicts, always remembering the standard of courage and effectiveness established by their predecessors in that small French village. The Battle of Cantigny had proven that American soldiers were ready to take their place among the world's elite fighting forces, a position they have maintained ever since.